All right, so welcome back. We're going to finish up Unit 1 here. And I thought we'd just take a moment and kind of go over a couple things that we talked about yesterday. So remember, of course, we'll be looking at 2 multiple choice questions. We'll talk about those a little bit more later. And so we spent a lot of time talking at the beginning about data and how important data is. And that's really going to relate to that second question you're going to have, that quantitative question. You're going to have some kind of chart and you're going to have to analyze it. And so it's a quantitative question because it does actually give you data. From quantitative data, we can then make a qualitative analysis, that judgment call. That's where we start getting normative statements, where we can make an empirical statement based on the data, and then we can infer something from that, make a judgment call, that normative statement. And when we're looking at these, we're always trying to figure out as political scientists, is there a correlation? And if there is a correlation, is there also causation? Okay, so 2 things can be related. We can have a correlation. Correlation does not necessarily mean that it's definitely a causation. But if it's a causation, there is definitely some kind of relationship. And so those are important things to consider when we're looking at, especially when you're looking at data like voting or the economy, anything, all of these things relate to each other. Increases in legitimacy, like if we hold a referendum. When I was talking to the member of parliament today, Siobhan, we asked her about Brexit, how that affected, and it was very interesting. And she talked about that they had this referendum and the people said this is what they wanted. Every time we really have an election, that's also a referendum where people get to say what they want. All right, and so we talked a little bit too about political systems, how that works. So let's take a little look at our lovely little pyramid here. So reminding how these things work. I also thought it was interesting because we talk about that this chart is frustrating for us as Americans because it's using words that we define in different ways. And she kept saying the government, the government, the government. And when she said the government, she meant Boris Johnson. Like she clarified and said the government of Boris Johnson. And so I think that's an important distinction. And so the state, remember, is the United Kingdom. The regime would be a democratic democracy. They are a democratic regime. They are a constitutional monarchy. Their regime is democracy. When we're thinking about regimes, our choices are democracies, authoritarian regimes. You can be a hybrid. You could be somewhere in between. People debate about Russia. Russia was an illiberal democracy, kind of when Putin started. And then now we say that they're semi-authoritarian, and there's people who argue that they're actually full-fledged authoritarian, okay? China, full-fledged authoritarian. When we think about democracy, democratic regimes, we can look at, say, Mexico, who's more liberal, like the UK is, versus Nigeria, who's more illiberal. And then your government is your actual leaders. So if we're looking at this with the United States, we have the state is the United States of America, the regime, we're a democratic republic or a democracy, and our government is President Trump. He leads our government right now. So we'll get into the discussion about heads of state, heads of government, which is always to me like a good way to think about this. Like Boris Johnson is the head of government and Queen Elizabeth II is the head of state, okay? So we're gonna get more into that with Unit 2 when we start looking at executive systems. So we looked at this nice little chart that was done by Mr. Caneen with what are the different regimes types, and that we're pretty much kind of 6 and 6, 6 democracies, 6 more authoritarian. We also talked about that there is the concept of a nation, and that remember that a nation is people with a common culture and a common language. And so the UK is a state made up of 4 nations. You can be, so Germany, so kind of my go-to example, because it's for the most part, it does have smaller groups inside of it, like the Turks. There's 1 million Turkish people living in Germany, the greatest number of Turks outside of Turkey. And so they would be maybe a nation within Germany. But when Germany was formed, it was those people coming together who had formerly been like from Prussia and such. So nations, again, people of a common culture, language. So if we think about China, there's the Uyghurs, the Tibetans. If we think about in, we could, you know, Nigeria, all the different ethnic groups that are there speaking lots of different languages. And I do want us to keep this image of the UK in mind, because it's going to come back to us in a little bit when we're talking about unitary versus federal. So we've already kind of discussed this, the idea of a democracy versus authoritarian. And remember the types of democracy: liberal, illiberal. Kind of also keep in mind those terms, procedural and substantive democracies. I like to think about them as a substantive democracy has substance to it, like there's something to it. The US, the UK, like that's what we would say is that liberal democracy. Procedural, it's on paper. Russia, do they have rule of law? No. Is it in their constitution? Yes. Freedom of speech in their constitution? Yes. Does it happen? In reality, there's limits on it, okay? And remember, the further extreme of an authoritarian, which we don't see currently in any of our leaders, is totalitarian. All right, and we talked about what do those democracies look like. I think I mentioned pretty much all these except for political participation. And we're going to look at that a lot more into Unit 3, because that's where we start talking about civil society, where we have voluntary groups that are not controlled by the government, what we would in America call interest groups. We'll also look more at kind of checks and balances or branch independence when we talk about executive and legislative and judicial branches tomorrow. All right, so we were kind of finishing off with this democratization. So remember that democratization means the growth of democracy. And that term, that means that I've got a good solid democracy that's not going to be easily broken up by a coup or something like that. That would be democratic consolidation, okay? So like Nigeria, when they first began and they broke away from the UK, that's when those coups happen more often. Like we haven't had one in a while in Nigeria because they're getting closer to that process of a real kind of solid democracy. We think about ways that we do increase democracy by expanding suffrage, giving people the right to vote, making sure that elections are secure and fair. One of the things I found also very fascinating in the UK talk today with the Prime Minister, the Member of Parliament, Ms. McDonough, she was talking about in Britain, she was saying that she thought one of the problems with our elections in the United States was money. And so in Britain, there's actually, I didn't realize this, there's actually, I knew about the ads and stuff that they can't advertise on TV. But they actually have a cap on how much money you can raise. And she also said that the money raising is the responsibility of the party, versus in America, the money raising is very much the responsibility of the candidate. And she said, you know, that really, she thought, inhibited, you know, our democratic process. Okay, transparency is also very important, how transparent you are. And then we talked a lot about rule of law and the importance of rule of law and how that, can we count on that if the leader of your country commits a crime, are they going to be held accountable for that? If a member of your legislature commits a crime, if I get arrested, is due process going to happen? You know, those are the kind of things that we're looking for. And we talked about what can hurt democracy. Well, when your government is, of course, not perceived as legitimate, when there are problems with unfair elections, anything that can be done to stifle democracy. When you try to have a protest and you're put down by the government, for example, Tiananmen Square. When we think about Tiananmen Square, we talked about how that this concept that the more economic freedom you get, the more political freedom you tend to demand. This is something that we have seen that is an actual causation, okay? We've seen this in history. Now, when we look at China, as they've got more freedom and more economic freedom under Deng Xiaoping, under the 4 modernizations, remember, he's the guy who said that it doesn't matter if the cat is white or black as long as he catches the mouse. And he was talking about implementing capitalist policies, neoliberalism, including some of that economic freedoms where they started to privatize, not everything was government controlled, start to use a little bit of capitalism. And as a result, students, college students went out to Tiananmen Square and started demanding more democracy. And they were put down, okay? Literally put down by the police, by tanks. And even today, finding out information about that, the media censors that. So that's a threat to their attempt to even gain some democracy. Recent protests in Hong Kong have been put down. And so China continues to stifle any chances that the people are demanding. Might eventually happen, but it's going to take a big change, right? And so how do we make those changes? How do we make those changes in power and authority? Well, first of all, let's think about what are our sources of power and authority. We've got traditional, like we think about like the king, the queen, you know, how the monarchy has kind of existed in Britain. Most of what we see though in countries is based on rational legal authority. Your source of power authority comes from the Constitution. Why do we do what we do and follow the rules in the United States? Because of our Constitution. Our elections, they're a peaceful transfer of power. I remember when Clinton and Trump were running against each other and everybody was just worried the world was going to fall apart. And I was like, no matter what happens, we're going to be okay. People kind of looked at me weird. And I've been accused of being naive because I truly do believe in, and I wouldn't say naive, I'm typically a pessimist. I like to say a realist. But the one thing that I'm optimistic about is the fact that I do believe that separation of powers and checks and balances truly work in our US government. I know people think I'm crazy, but I do believe this. And what I know when we look at our history is that when we elect somebody, it's a peaceful transfer of power. I don't think that President Obama was super happy to step down and let President Trump come in, but was it a peaceful transfer of power? Of course it was. And it happens every time that we have an election. So we also have charismatic authority. You can think about any leader that when they speak, people are just kind of drawn to them. We talked about that recently when I was talking about Cory Booker, how that when I listened to him talk on YouTube, that I was like, wow, you know, he's got that little bit of charisma. Pete Buttigieg obviously had it because so many people were following him. President Trump definitely had it. There's tons of people who are attracted by his charismatic authority. And so we can see that in leaders of our CG6. President Putin obviously has it. No denying it. Like, even if you don't like his politics, like there's still something like, something that you're drawn into. And we can also see that like in 1979 with the Iranian Revolution with Ayatollah Khomeini, has it more than the current one has. And then religious authority, very much important in Iran, the importance of Sharia law, the importance of Islam. Political parties can also be like United Russia in Britain, excuse me, in Russia. It's not really the party though, it's Putin's party, right? So it still kind of revolves around him. Versus in China, it's the Communist Party. And then your military can be another source of authority. So how do we change it? How's China going to change it? I honestly think it might take another revolution. I don't think an election or a coup is going to do it because they don't have elections. And a coup, just if they overthrow this leader, you still have that communist state. It would have to be a true revolution. So remember, a revolution is a regime change versus a coup d'etat, not a coup. A coup d'etat is an overthrow of your leader, an overthrow of your government. And so elections are an example of a peaceful change of power and authority. All right, so here's where we left off yesterday. We're talking about a country, a state, has a choice. How do they want to distribute their power? And you basically have three options. You can be a unitary state, a confederal state, or a federal state. Of our CG6, it's very easy. There are 3 unitary and 3 federal. So think in your head if you got them all straight before I say them. So, or does anybody want to unmute and volunteer to do my unitary? Who can give me my 3 unitary?
Oh, I can. Oh, never mind. Sydney, you have.
I can't hear anybody. Okay, then. All right. So unitary would be the United Kingdom, China, and Iran. Confederal, nobody basically functions as a confederal state today. The EU kind of is our best example. Federal would be Nigeria, Mexico, and Russia. Think about Russia's name. It's the Russian Federation. Mexico's official name, the United United States. United States of Mexico? Mexican States. Mexican United States. And then Nigeria is a federal republic, okay? So unitary, your power is consolidated, centralized at the national level, okay? You give some authority to your locals, okay? Your regional governments, they have some, but not a whole lot of power, okay? All the power really is coming from that unitary, that central. In a federal system, that power is shared, okay? So in every state, you've got regional authority and you've got your central authority. Where's that power? So if I'm a unitary state, that power is all in that central, okay? If I'm federal, it's a shared. In confederal, it's the opposite, okay? In confederal, the regionals have all the power and there's very little coming together, okay? But we want to focus on unitary and federal because that's what our CG6 are. And that's what most countries in the world actually are unitary. So it's actually not truly representative of our CG6 to have 3 and 3, 50%, you know, that are one. So most countries in the world are actually unitary. When we think about why you would want to be unitary, why you would want to be federal, we're going to start looking at those differences. Remember that federal is going to work often better in larger republics and also places that are more diverse. So then you take China. China is very large. Why doesn't China choose to be federal? China's government doesn't want to give up the power, okay? You take a country like Nigeria. Nigeria basically has to be federal because they are so diverse. Now, if I'm a unitary state and I've got all this power in the national government and my regional governments have this little bit of power, I can give them more power. The way that I give them power is through devolution. So we have seen that the Welsh, the Irish, the Northern Irish, and the Scottish have all had their parliaments recognized. They have a certain amount of authority. Now, ultimately, they still answer to the British government, to that UK government, to the House of Commons in London. But they've been given a certain amount of power through devolution. In a federal system, the opposite of that, taking away power, that would be where you're centralizing your authority, which is what we see in Russia, how that Putin continues to consolidate power and take power away from those regions that they have. When you think about federalism too, remember that this beautiful sharing of power that we have in the United States really does not work anywhere else, okay? Nowhere in the world does federalism work quite like it does in the United States. We literally are the poster child for this is what federalism should look like. So you take Nigeria, one of their big problems is their allocation of resources, that the states are very dependent upon the federal government for help. So I was just in a school board meeting, and in that school board meeting, Dr. Shook was talking about how that we basically have a 2.1 million budget shortfall. Okay, we got 1 million less than we asked for from the school board. They gave us the exact same amount that they did from the board of supervisors. They gave us the exact same amount as last year. And then we're getting $1 million basically less from the Virginia government. Now, we weren't expecting as much. Our money comes from the state, right? Because we talk about education is primarily held by the states. If we were in Nigeria, our state would be very dependent upon that national government to provide any kind of help, okay? So that's really that difference there. So why do you choose? What's the advantages? Which one's better, okay? Really depends on your country. How diverse is your country? If you have a large, diverse country, federal is probably going to be your best bet, okay? So federal advantages, it's going to help protect all those different groups that you have. So we're going to make sure that all those hundreds of ethnicities that we see in Nigeria are going to be able to have a voice. It also kind of makes sure that there's a check to keep there from being too much power, you know, in the federal government, the national government, kind of that thing. Make sure that citizens, one of the things I love too is that citizens have more opportunities to engage politically and have a role in government because they can serve at the local level and the regional level before they even get up to the federal level. And it allows for experimentation. Wonderful example of is how we're handling the legalization of marijuana in the United States. The fact that some states are getting to experiment, and we can learn from them. So whenever Virginia decides that they want to legalize marijuana, we can see what Colorado did right, what they did wrong. Okay, and we can take all those things into consideration. The other thing is, and I mentioned this so many times when we talk about federalism, what's good for California is not necessarily what's good for Virginia. And when we think about this too, you think about that in Nigeria, think about that in Russia, think about that in Mexico. Like the issues that Mexico City faces are very different than what they're facing in northern Mexico and in southern Mexico. There's definite regional differences between the north and the south in Mexico. And so the fact that the states, those 30-some states, get to have some authority in what they're doing makes a big difference, okay? Now, unitary, the best thing about unitary is there's way more equality, possibly even equity, if we want to say the difference between, of course, equality and equity, is that resources can be distributed from richer areas to poorer areas. We can make sure that you as the national government are making decisions about what's best for your citizens. It also allows you to make sure that power is centralized in authority. You're also not going to have a difference of maybe conflicting what one state does versus what another state does. So, you know, what are the divorce laws in North Dakota? You know, like there's laws that are different in each state. Same thing happens in Mexico, Nigeria, and Russia. Okay, so that's one thing you want to consider, is that what's the differences, and whatever advantage of one, of course, is a disadvantage of the other. So when I ask the question, why would a unitary state want to devolve power? Why does the UK want to give power to Scotland and Wales? Okay, that's an important thing to think about. They want to prevent the ethnic groups from rising up, right? You want to try to make your ethnic groups happy. So take those advantages that are in the federal column, okay, and that's going to be what you need to do, and that why you would want to become, in essence, more federal by devolving power. They also, and a big thing is to prevent people from getting upset, like Scotland. Scotland actually held a referendum whether or not they wanted to be part of the United Kingdom. And so by giving them more autonomy, giving them more power, then that hopefully is going to appease them and keep them in, okay? Think about that in China. Do they want to give the Tibetans, the Uyghurs, more authority? Now, in China, because they're authoritarian, kind of the opposite is happening. They've been putting Uyghurs into concentration camps. They took away the Dalai Lama in Tibet. You know, different countries teach people a different way. In Turkey, their response to the Kurds is to, you know, not allow them to speak their own language. Remember that in the UK for a while, it was against the law to speak Welsh. And they, not necessarily, I'm sorry, it wasn't against the law to speak Welsh. They didn't teach Welsh in school. And so the Welsh fought for that to get that back, okay? And so you want to think about that. Why would a unitary country devolve power? Why would they want to give power back to the regional governments? Okay. Any questions about federal versus unitary? Because this is a super important part of what we're talking about. This is one of those, when we think about like main concepts that I want to make sure I have a good grasp on, federal versus unitary, parliamentary versus presidential. Like those are two very key, I guess, technically 4 topics, but those concepts are really important. All right, so the last part that we have in Unit 1 is legitimacy and stability, okay? And so we often were getting the words legitimacy and authority mixed up. So I want you to understand, remember that authority or sovereignty is your right to rule, okay? So it's the right, the authority for your government to be in power, their right to have their power. Now, is that a legitimate source of power? Like, do we recognize that as a legitimate source of power, that they are a legitimate source of authority? That's where legitimacy comes in, okay? So it's whether or not the citizens perceive that the government actually has the right to use the powers the way that they do, okay? So there are ways that we can increase legitimacy, and our favorite answer, so when we were taking a regular test, I told you any question you ask, like one of the things that almost always an answer, right, is increases legitimacy. So if you have no idea what answer to put, increases legitimacy, it was almost always an answer. I'm not sure how well that's going to work for us on the way that this style test is working, sadly. But legitimacy is such an important concept. So what are your sources of legitimacy? Okay, I got listed a bunch here. These are all the things that the College Board tells us are sources, not just the College Board tells us, but they're in the College Board list. Okay, so obviously elections are sources of your legitimacy, right? And how stable your government is has to do with how is that perceive or perception of legitimacy. Nationalism can be a source of legitimacy. Tradition, how effective is your government? Like, do we trust our government? If I live in Nigeria, do I trust my government? Probably not, right? Their government is very corrupt. That's a big problem. Economic growth. So if you track back, I don't know how well you remember the recession when you were younger, but man, people had a lot of thoughts on the government at that point. Okay, when the economy is not doing well, people have a lot of thoughts about the government, and they're not very happy thoughts. And so when the economy is doing well, maybe our trust in the government increases. Think about this. When you're thinking about legitimacy, you can almost sometimes equate it to trust in the government. For example, when we talk about decline in trust in American government, like Vietnam, how did that really decline the trust that we had in the government? So if you remember when Putin first took over, we actually talked about this, that there was that incident and that led to their Crimean War, and that some journalists have claimed that Putin actually, not he himself, but basically this terrorist attack that was attributed to the, to Chechnya, not to Crimea, I'm getting my C's mixed up here, to the Chechens, and then led to this war in Chechnya. It actually increased his popularity and all this. It was very good for his government. The economy has also grown under him. Like when people are like, how do people like him? Like he's taking away people's civil liberties. Economy has done super well under him. Like if you look at that little chart, if we look at the data, we're gonna see that it has grown. So those things can play a part. When we think about ideology can also influence things. Like we think about, so when the 2009 protests were happening in Iran, where they were protesting Ahmadinejad's re-election. Katie's not here. I can't make her say that 10 times fast. And so when the Ayatollah came forward and said, stop, people stopped, okay? Because of his religious authority, okay? Because they believe in him, that ideology that he has. When you think about in China, what are they doing it for? We're doing it for the Communist Party, that belief in that, or for Mao, or for Uncle Jai, or, you know, whatever it is that you believe. Religious heritage organizations, the dominant political party's endorsement, if they're saying this is okay. So how do we maintain legitimacy? All of these things, if we want to have elections that are legitimate, we need to make sure that we feel like that they are not corrupt, that they are being held. And you can go back again to like Mexico creating the IEFC, which puts a check on elections. You can do things like referendums. A referendum is a wonderful way to increase legitimacy. When the Russian Federation became Russia, as opposed to the Soviet Union, one of the things that Yeltsin did was he had them vote on the Constitution through a referendum. Let the people vote on it, okay? And how can legitimacy be undermined? Corruption is one of the biggest ways that legitimacy can be undermined if people don't trust the government. There's other ways where we see where protests get put down when civil liberties and civil rights are kind of crushed. If you speak out and all those kind of things. If you view your leaders as corrupt, how legitimate is that? If you think your elections are rigged, like there are a number of people, like the riot girls in Russia, they argue, of course, that the elections are not legitimate. And so when we talk about democracies, that first definition is that they have to be free, fair, competitive elections. And that's why people are saying that Russia, we can't even really consider it. Can we even really consider it a democracy if they're not truly fair, free, competitive elections? Okay. All right. So that wraps up Unit 1.